most feedback in organisations is actually positive and optimistic. The idea of sort of that, well, feedback is something that we can only be honest about if we keep it secret, and feedback's always critical and so on, it's bunkum.
Welcome back to another episode of A Kiwi Original, the show where we cover uniquely Kiwi stories contributing to New Zealand's future. And today I'm joined by Michael Carden, who is the founder of JoyousHQ, a company that's all about opening up feedback to increase employee engagement, because no one wants to do a survey. And a lot of people know that no one reads the survey results anyway. So we're going to have an interesting chat. I'm fascinated by Michael's journey up until now and where he sees JoyousHQ going. So first of all, Michael, thank you for coming on the show.
Hey, it's good to be here.
So let's talk a little bit about JoyousHQ. What was wrong with the way that these major companies were doing employee feedback with surveys?
Yeah, I mean, look. I mean, I guess that the initial piece of provocation when we started Joyous is we talked to lots of working people in large organisations who had some kind of annual or periodic staff survey done, and the general consensus was that nothing ever changes. That people provide feedback and no action occurs, and it kind of struck us that was probably because what really happened in traditional surveys is that you ask a bunch of questions in some kind of form, and that's all anonymised, and it goes off and it kind of gets aggregated into a big report that a bunch of people sit around a board table looking at, and then they take some action, but they're kind of big macro actions by that point, right? And those macro actions don't seem particularly related to the feedback that you gave, and gosh, they might have taken 6 months to get to a kind of program or a policy where something was introduced. So this idea that feedback didn't spark action was probably the starting point. But like all good stories, the starting point's not the end point. There's lots of twists and turns on the way once we started on that journey.
That could be quite damaging, I think, for a business when you're taking macro action. I saw there was an example on, I think it was on your site, where an organisation had asked about the hot desking, and overall it was kind of neutral, but the one group that were the developers, it was intensely negative for. And I was thinking, it's hard to attract high-tech software developers. The last thing you'd want to do is make it detract that work environment.
Yeah, it's an interesting. I know the case study you're talking about. We've done, I guess, a big sort of review of a bunch of different large enterprises that moved to open feedback from a kind of traditional anonymous feedback situation recently, and that's a good example. So feedback really works at two levels in the corporation. There's this kind of micro level, this kind of micro transactional feedback. So it's like I show up to work on a Tuesday morning after I drop my daughter at daycare, and because I arrive a little bit later than normal, I don't have a desk to sit next to my squad because I'm a developer and our organisation uses hot desking, and that's a kind of piece of micro feedback. And actually, what happens there is that the leader, the person's manager, might go, oh well, on Tuesdays we'll make sure that we keep a desk for you, and kind of closing that loop and that kind of micro transaction. That's the important piece, right? But then the flip side of it is that we have all of these little conversations going on, these little pieces of dialogue, which is what Joyous does, and how we generate feedback kind of conversationally. And we've got this big piece of kind of machine-driven intelligence over here that's actually looking at all of that stuff and going like, oh well, actually in this particular building of yours, you've got maybe a cohort of 200 developers, and actually they're all unhappy with your hot desking environment. This is how it's affecting them, and this is the reasons it's affecting them, and these are the kind of macro actions you might be able to take. So it's this idea that feedback kind of gets separated into the micro transactional stuff, and the macro stuff is what we do. But the interesting part of it is that we've all grown into this world now where so much of the way we interact with the world is kind of microtransactional. We expect there to be kind of instantaneous gratification. So we're sort of used to providing some feedback and something happening, rather than kind of providing some feedback and it eventually rolling up into report that may or may not generate some action.
That's a fascinating insight in itself. So you're saying as consumers and as humans with this instant real-time world we're living in, it's jarring with corporate cultures where things aren't being acted upon, at least in an employee engagement way, because it's an annual survey rather than a micro request and a micro action.
Yeah, look. If you post a photo on Instagram or something on Facebook, or you create a TikTok, you're sitting there expecting someone to like it, aren't you? You're expecting there to be some kind of, I guess, piece of gratification in it. And so many enterprise processes, feedback aside, don't really have any level of this instantaneous gratification that the world has trained us to expect over the last sort of decade or so.
So that then brings me on to an area which is how do you get employees to shift and believe and trust that the corporate is going to take action? Because isn't there a risk to, there's a personal risk of if you say what you're complaining about or want to improve, and it's open feedback so people know who you are. How do you make sure that it's received in the right way?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating topic, right? I mean, actually, at Joyous, our product vision is that, we want to create an environment where people feel comfortable giving and receiving feedback, and that feedback sparks action, like we were talking about. And I think that, if you just take it back to kind of first principles, if you want to create an environment where people feel comfortable giving feedback, then you have to have a high level of what's known as psychological safety. If you're a kind of org psych kind of person, you need high levels of psychological safety. Now, if the only way you ever collect feedback or the only way you ever ask for feedback is in some kind of anonymous survey, you just sort of send this message to everyone in the organisation that feedback is unsafe, and you just kind of continually reinforce this idea that feedback is somehow unsafe. So you kind of actually just have to break that paradigm, right? You just have to just completely break it. And then once you decide to break it, well, it's not quite as binary as it might sound, right? Because you do have to actually think about how people provide feedback and how people feel comfortable around feedback. And that sort of starts with how people receive feedback. And the interesting thing is that the whole sort of traditional world of feedback was built around these kind of, very sort of instrumentation-driven kind of org psych kind of models, where they'd ask questions about things which are important to the organisation, like leadership, and they'd ask them in sort of such a way that was kind of ego bruising to leaders, and so you sort of had to make it anonymous. But you actually can provide feedback to your manager in a way that's constructive. You just have to be kind of guided in how to do that. And so the simplest example is you kind of focus on outcomes which are important to employees. So rather than focusing on leadership behaviours, focus on outcomes. So a good example is, do you feel that you have clear objectives and you understand how your work contributes to what we're trying to achieve as a business? Well, that's an outcome of good management. But actually, most employees will sort of view that, and most leaders will view that as kind of being, well, an objective, and if I'm not doing a great job of that, it kind of lights the path, and I know that, well, what I should do is I should set clear objectives, but I haven't kind of had my ego bruised. So there's a lot of work actually in how you kind of drive the conversations and how you work that piece. The other thing too that people don't realise is that most feedback in organisations is actually positive and optimistic. If you actually ask for feedback, a lot of the time you get reinforcement that, like, hey, these things are going well, and so on. So the idea of sort of that, well, feedback is something that we can only be honest about if we keep it secret, and feedback's always critical and so on. It's bunkum. It's sort of like it's treating the exception as the rule. Now, that said, of course, there is times when there is sensitive feedback, if it's related to harassment, for instance, or something like that. But of course, you build different processes of dealing with that. You don't say, well, that's actually the way we provide feedback in the organisation, is just to deal with the exceptions.
What do you give as tools for the managers or for the leaders once you've set up this granular way of providing feedback that's going to spark action? How do you make sure that managers and leaders have the tools to spark the right action?
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of an astute point. We've done a lot of work on actually providing kind of guidelines on how you react to feedback. So sometimes one of the things which we've learned a lot about is this idea of equivalency of effort. So if someone if you ask someone for feedback on a particular topic, and they provide screeds of information, they take some photos, and they kind of give you this thing, and you kind of respond with something like thanks or a thumbs up. You haven't you haven't provided any equivalent effort. You might actually go, well, actually, we should have a conversation about this, offline. Let's have a one-on-one. Let's go for a coffee, or there's a lot of elements around that where we kind of provide coaching, and we build more and more of that in tool to help you do that. I mean, the other good example I've seen is just sort of a very kind of a beauty of conversational feedback. So feedback where, as a leader or a subject matter expert, I can get involved in the feedback. It's an opportunity to ask for more information. So if someone is particularly unhappy with something in their work environment, then you can actually ask for some more detail, and that's really useful because it gives you a bigger data set to analyze stuff. It actually allows you to kind of get to the bottom of things. I think one of the biggest mistakes that leaders often have in feedback, and we see this borne out, is that someone says, hey, I'm really concerned about this, and I think we should do this, and the leader responds with, I've already thought of that, we'll do that soon. Rather than going, oh, that's really good input, is there any other ideas you have around it, letting the kind of feedback influence your behavior rather than kind of wanting to appear that you have the answers. And of course, that's the beauty of a good feedback culture, right? You build this transparency where you accept that as a leader you have very few of the answers, and that more times than not, your frontline staff and all these sort of people will have more likely have more of the answer than you do.
Is there a part here where there is been actually a shift of culture about how to give and receive feedback? 10, 15 years ago, pre-cell phone, pre-most of the internet, it was very much a face-to-face cultural way of doing it, where we've got a next generation coming through now where they prefer to be in the DM or on a text message or in the apps. Are you picking up on a demographic shift on how to communicate?
Yeah, no. So there, absolutely, there is a demographic shift. But the thing which is interesting in this is that one of the things which software companies particularly have kind of done in the enterprise software market is they've kind of fallen into this trap of building software with an assumption that everyone is sitting in an office similar to the place where you're building the software. Whereas the reality of most work is actually not like that. That 70% of people don't work in offices, as a simple for instance. So actually a very large percentage of people are actually sitting there, actually out in the in the field and so on, and they haven't been interacting in the way that we might traditionally think that people interact with feedback anyway. So you talk about creating inclusive cultures and wanting people to be wanting to have high levels of inclusion in business, and that's a very fashionable topic. But actually, the starting point for that is often making sure that everyone's included in the conversation. That you pick up on this thing that some people like to be included in the conversation in a kind of more sort of phone text kind of driven way, and they like to take photos and share them and do that sort of thing. But actually, almost by necessity, a lot of people are only included in the conversation like that, because if you're working, driving a truck delivering LPG cylinders, you're not in the office anyway. You're not kind of in that kind of interaction. So I think it's partly driven by a cultural shift, but it's more driven by sort of awakening to the necessity that that's actually the way that most working people are connected to their organisations.
What have you learned so far from all of the insights you're getting back across the organisations you've got as customers?
I think there's two things which really strike me this year, and maybe these aren't the biggest two, but they're just things which are, I guess, top of mind currently. The first one is that feedback used to be an HR topic. Employee feedback used to be something that was owned by the human resources department or the people and culture department or some kind of that part of the business. There's this realization now that employee feedback is it's a company-wide, it's an enterprise-wide thing. And so in the past, employee feedback was always asking you about engagement, employee experience, and those sort of things. I think now what we're finding is that more often than not, it's asking about really business-specific issues. So we've got some very, very large clients in different countries who might ask their field service engineers questions about how how their tools work in the field. So you might be laying fiber optic cable as part of your job, and it's like, okay, well, the fiber optic cable gets twisted. what can I do about that? Those sort of business specific things. And then I think the second big thing is this, the real sort of aha to me is that, we touched on it before, this idea that for feedback to be honest, it sort of somehow needed to always be anonymous and so on, which is just not true, right? And the thing we've learned is that employees don't really care for anonymity. What they're concerned about is that people treat their feedback seriously and they apply care to it and they take action based on that. And that's a lot more important than this kind of idea of anonymity. Now, there's concerns about where my feedback goes and how it's used, but they're really part of this idea that I care what happens to my feedback. And as soon as you get into that mode, as soon as you overcome that hump and people realise that their feedback is actually acted on and people take it seriously, then working people are so much more forthcoming. They provide so much more feedback because they actually realise that it has a value, and it's personal value, not just some kind of distant abstract value.
Hey, just a quick interruption. Thanks for watching a Kiwi original. If you're liking this episode, then hit the notification button, and that means you'll see when every new episode gets released. We've done 40 already. We've got another 50 lined up. Right, now back to the episode. There must be some amazing aha moments for the senior management team once your system gets implemented and they start seeing feedback that either changes their perception or reinforces it, so they now actually can take real action, but on a much faster pace. Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, look, so there's two sort of things that I think always strike people. The first is that we provide a kind of live feed of feedback, right? So you've getting all this feedback that's coming through, and it suddenly connects you to the front line again. So we've seen this example in construction where I've got a CEO and people, they're asking questions which are very kind of engagement related in this instance. Are you proud of the work that you do? And people are going, I'm really proud of this. I'm proud of this concrete floor I've just laid, and they're taking a photo of a smooth concrete floor. And so suddenly as a CEO, you're sitting there with this live feed of stuff that people are working on, and you can kind of organize it in ways you want and cut it in all sorts of different ways based on how what sentiment people have and where they're in the country and so on. But fundamentally, I can just interact and go, hey, you should be proud of that. I'd be proud of that floor. That looks great, So there's this sort of this connective piece, this thing which just didn't exist before. And so that's probably the biggest kind of thing we get. But we also are so good at finding, using our machine intelligence and other approaches, finding the kind of disaggregated information. And this is like this is not just an aha moment for senior leaders. It's been one for us, right? It's this idea that actually, we've had such a heritage in the HR space of treating employee experience like it's contiguous, like that everyone wants the same things. Whereas actually what you might find is that 90% of people are thrilled with something and 10% of people don't like it, they want it to work differently. Well, if you're an organisation of 10,000 people, that 10%, that's 1,000 people who have some kind of opinion. And that opinion might actually have some real value to you, right? So it's oftentimes not just the element of let's get a kind of averaged view. It's actually the way that we can actually take this sort of disaggregated approach and find cohorts that act and work in different ways. And of course, that's often where you find the inspiration to kind of go to the next level within your business. It's not in the sort of averaged, but it's in the outliers. And so, I think that we see a lot of, that's a real shift. That's not the way that people have dealt with employee data before.
Interesting. I like the idea of being one of that senior management team, and you get a real live feed of inspirational moments from the front staff, because that can buoy you along in your work because you don't feel disconnected from it. And it also means that when you're working on strategy, you can think about, well, these are the people that are actually going to execute it. You could probably reverse it and ask their opinion on things because you can have side conversation on it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we see that all the time, right? One of the things we've kind of got to manage is in some very large organizations is kind of almost curbing the enthusiasm of the senior leaders, because they're suddenly kind of going, why don't we next time you're in the HQ, why don't we get together and have a coffee and talk about this? And it's like, if you're 7 layers below the CEO and he suddenly wants to get, or she suddenly wants to get involved in your piece of work, it's sometimes a bit of a shock to the system.
Let's talk about the actual JoyousHQ as a software company in New Zealand. Because Michael, you've you've had got a little bit of fame and history on the scene. You've had Sonar 6, the employee performance review software that was sold, I think it was in 2012. You've been involved in Flossie, more recently Askly, ProMap. What do you bring from each of these as you evolve it into the next software business, and what made you want to start JoyousHQ?
Sure. Look, I think there's a certain amount of pattern matching which you bring from business to business, and you kind of you learn more about recognizing maybe strengths in people and how you can apply them to different things and so on. But the main thing I would suggest is that the software business or any tech business moves quickly, right? And so the reality of it is that you don't actually have lots of the stuff which I learned at Sonar 6, if I was still relying on that, would be just useless right now. So I think that my involvement in different projects has really just helped kind of keep you fresh and keep you understanding what the leading edge of building tech businesses look like. As to why we started Joyous, I think that tech had moved forward, and we really wanted to apply some tech, some of the changes in tech around artificial intelligence and microtransactions and some of these integrations. We wanted to apply that to the enterprise and build something new, and that was kind of an exciting technical challenge. But I think also, though, there's a real purpose to this, right? A purpose on two levels. One is that we wanted to make life better for working people. And that's really what we want to do as a business. And our immediate contribution to that is to try and give all working people a voice. But as an adjunct to that, we recognise that we can't make life better for working people by ourselves. So it forces us to kind of collaborate and kind of help on that objective. Then the other part of it is, we wanted to build an iconic New Zealand tech business. We really wanted to build something of substance, and that's an objective that's, I guess, much bigger than myself and my co-founder and our founding kind of group. But it is this thing that you want to build a business that is, like I said, iconic, something of substance for New Zealand.
So on that, is this a business that you are looking at? It's not just for New Zealand companies, it's for any company that has, how many employees does it need to have in order for it to get interesting for Joyous?
Look, our goal is always to work with the world's largest employers, right? And we do have, we already have on our roster some companies in the world's 50 largest companies. So we're getting into that stride. I think that we typically don't work with companies with less than 1,000 staff, but from time to time, if they have particularly interesting objectives or particularly interesting things they want to achieve, or things where we feel we can help or we can kind of learn, we go below that number. But that's sort of it's to us larger employers that really do interest us the most, just because it's the way we can have the most impact.
So that creates a bit of a marketing challenge for you then, because there's a very small club of that in New Zealand comparatively to the US, for example, or UK. How do you then get that marketing message out there and do some of the lead generation, the marketing automation, the branding, and then post-COVID, do you have to get on a plane still, or is it all kind of remote Zoom? What's the onboarding like? All of those things I'm thinking of as a marketer.
Look, I think that the commentary on what happens post-COVID is no one really knows, do they? Right at the moment, there's no disadvantage at all, is there? If you're an enterprise sales organisation, your only challenge, for us as as an exporter into the US and Europe and other countries, is that we kind of have some challenge on time zone, but it's been a great leveler, right? We're all on Zoom, aren't we? So it's not like our competitors are able to get in the car and we're not. It's like we're all on Zoom. As to how that plays out, I'm not sure. From the perspective of targeting customers, we're really an account-based marketing company, not wanting to get kind of too arcane, but the nature of going after the world's largest companies is we sort of know who they are, don't we? So even in New Zealand, we know exactly what that group of customers or potential customers looks like, and we can kind of target them and go after them and explain our message. But I would say we're very much a product led business at this point. That we don't have a large sales team. We've got a very large engineering team, and that's kind of how it works, because we're the challenge, the objective we're going after is building something that really works at scale. It works in these very, very large companies, and that's not a trivial challenge, right? And so you really focus on getting that right. You focus on doing that with a handful of customers. They're big deals. You kind of grow out from there. There's not actually really a sense of, okay, we need to go out and build a huge marketing pipeline and build marketing automation and so on. It's much more, let's get the product right, and it will grow mainly based on the investment we make in engineering, and then we'll kind of we'll grow the sales team slowly over time, but with a very finite number of companies which we target. Now, that's not to say we're a small business. We're certainly not. The deal sizes that we have are 6 or 7 figure deals annually, so they're big deals. But they're we don't need thousands of them.
Yeah, and I think that's very similar to how the Salesforce model originally started. Was they didn't need a lot of organizations to get underway. They just needed ones that had a few thousand employees each, because that gave them the scale. And then they could build out the product some more and then bring in consulting and over and over. I think time-wise, it'd be interesting to see where JoyousHQ goes over the next year or two, because I think some of these large organizations have introduced risk, even though they haven't changed anything as such. But as more employees, you have distributed workforces, it's hard to get the vibe of the office if everyone's not in the office at the same time. And it's not a massive shift, but I think over time, if you don't have that ability to do microtransactions, you could lose touch with the vibe or the ambience of your office.
Yeah. Yeah, look, we started in dispersed workforces anyway, though, right? As I sort of mentioned.
Yeah.
So even if you think about the clients we have, lots of them have people driving around in trucks, or people working on site, all these sorts of things. So this kind of idea that the enterprise is kind of centralized and now it's not necessarily that true off the time. Okay. What we're dealing with more at the moment is this sort of sense of companies who have some people who've been kind of pushed to work from home, as well as like large groups who are now essential workers and are kind of being forced out. And of course, for us sitting here in New Zealand, it's kind of, we've almost forgotten what that's like, haven't we? But that's a very kind of sort of stressful situation for the corporation. And of course, having great ability to kind of direct and request feedback and get involved in conversations certainly helps. And so we are part of the zeitgeist, aren't we? It's absolutely right at the moment is, this is the time for human resources to shine, and this is the time, as you sort of allude to, for the companies that actually are involved in connecting you with your employees to be successful. So we're in the great sort of lottery of COVID-19, we're on the uptick at the moment. We seem to have fallen into the right place in that regard.
Is there any uptick in terms of the organisations you approach seeing you as a New Zealand software company, where we've got these almost have COVID eradicated, at least for now? Or do you not go there with hey, we're a New Zealand software company? Do you go more on the merits of what your software does rather than where it's been created?
Look, we certainly don't shy away from the fact we're from New Zealand. I mean, people love New Zealand, and it's an absolutely great point of difference, isn't it? It's just, I think that there's a sort of trope out there that some of the most important kind of inventions come from unexpected places, and so New Zealand, to an extent, is a kind of in the psyche of a lot of Americans, it's a kind of unexpected place for a big innovation to maybe come from. But that said, we primarily lead on the fact that we've kind of we've created this new category of open conversational feedback, and so I think that's that's probably where the conversation starts. At some point, we're Kiwis, aren't we? We're not pretending not to be.
I think those are the two things I'm going to take away from this interview: is the open conversations is the first, and it's got to spark action is the second. And then the third, I think, which you've talked about, is the derivatives of that, what you can do when you've got all of these words and pieces of text, and if you can apply AI and machine learning to it, you can start to see trends based on location, based on role, based on when feedback comes in. You get to have all of this insight where in a few years, when you've got that across 1 million employees by country or 10 million, you're going to know what the gripes are worldwide of employees, and you're also going to know who's the most agile at responding to them.
Yeah, and look, and what works, like how you actually take action as an enterprise, and what actually affects people's performance and what affects your outcomes. And that's certainly the application of machine intelligence, which we enjoy, is this bit of actually really kind of understanding things which people haven't really understood before. I mean, if you talk about employee engagement, which is a pretty arcane topic, you'll hear a lot of people tell you that employee engagement, high engagement leads to high better business returns and high productivity. Well, that might be important, and that might be true, but actually understanding the causal pathways of that is not very, very clear. But what's more important is that kind of actually understanding how the employee experience, how people's experience of work kind of adds up to produce an outcome for your company and produce an outcome for them, for those people, is not even a topic. It's not even something that people really kind of think about those things.
True.
The reality of it is that I'm sure that work is not great for most people. It's called work. It's not called awesome, right? And if you can just make a small difference to people's experience of work, then you've actually made an impact, right? You've made an impact on what eats up all of our time, right?
And I think that's a wonderful quote to end on, Michael. I've learned a ton, and I think that where the JoyousHQ software fits in is, there are a lot of philosophies and theories about what you should do as a leader as manager, and there's lots of tangible work-based things that employees do every day. What you're getting at is this middle layer that optimizes the communication between the two. When you've got distributed workforces, and you don't want to be calling every single one of them every single day to see how they are, but you also don't want to wait until once a year and then ignore that information. And you want to be able to do it, so you're creating a honesty and trust within the organization. So it'd actually be interesting to see what happens to an organization once the software is rolled out in terms of open conversations outside of your software. Does it actually shift the entire culture?
No, we study lots of that stuff. That's part of the kind of outcomes we study. And it's the advantage of having, I guess, such large customers that we can build very close relationships with them, and understand those sorts of outcomes, because that's obviously what we're trying to impact.
Wonderful that you're creating this in New Zealand too. I really appreciate your time today, and thank you for what you're doing to continue software in New Zealand, even though you've had these previous successes, and to continue doing it over and over. That's employing more software developers here. It's getting our name out to some of the markets that we need to. Without tourism, education, and some of the things that have gone post-COVID, we need these waitlist services more than ever. So thank you for your work.
Everything's sitting on the shoulders of tech now, isn't it?
It is. This has been a Kiwi original brought to you by the New Zealand Made team. Thanks for watching. The New Zealand Made trademark is used by over 1,200 businesses in New Zealand. The New Zealand Made team licenses that trademark. Check if you're eligible at bynz.org.nz. If you feel that someone should see this, share it with them now. Otherwise, subscribe to youtube.com/bynzmade, and we'll see you on the next episode.